Well, it really is very great to be with you. Thank you for having me in your Septuagint session. I'm sorry that I'm going to spend some of my time actually attacking the very name of this session. My argument is going to be that we should cease using generally the word Septuagint because we should be using crystal clear terminology as we speak. I'm not arguing that there were not pre-Christian translations of almost all of the Old Testament into Greek. I recognise that some of these, especially the Pentateuch, had been fixed to a significant degree, and also I recognise that a significant source of quotations from the Old Testament in the New are from Greek translations that had been made before the time of the New Testament. But what I do want to do is I want to focus on how this word Septuagint has arisen and 8 different steps which have gone into the way we use the word today. I'm going to go through them briefly and then go through that in more detail. The first step is the movement from talking about 72 and then a noun describing the translators to 70 and a noun. The next step is moving from 70 and a noun to just having 70 without the noun. The next step is to move from having 70 people to having 70 as a thing. It's been reified. Alongside that, and also going on later than that, is the move from 70 as a plural, of course 70 is plural, to 70 as a singular. And then, as those shifts are going on with the name which becomes Septuagint, we also have shifts as to what's referred to. At first, the 72 or 70 translators are thought to have done the Pentateuch, but later, other books from the Old Testament. Then there's an extension from having done other books of the Old Testament to also doing some of the translated books of the Apocrypha. And a move from that, from them also having done translated books of the Apocrypha to some of the non-translated books of the Apocrypha, and then the most ridiculous of all that you see also in Ralph's edition of the so-called Septuagint is a movement from non-translated books to actually including parts of the New Testament as the Septuagint in the Odes, namely parts of Luke's Gospel and also a bit of post-Christian literature with the Gloria in Excelsis. So what we see here, just going back to this, is the very first move is from having 72 plus a noun to 70 plus a noun. This happens as we see. The earliest stage is that the letter of Aristeas, probably from the 1st century BC, talks about having 6 translators from each of the 12 tribes. That gives you 72 who are involved in translation. Similarly, we have the Babylonian Talmud giving us the number 72, but not giving us the number of translation. We also have Josephus' Antiquities, which talks about having 6 from each tribe, but then when it gives the total, it simply describes that as 70, as we see in the text here. So what we see is that it says, it doesn't seem necessary to me to tell you the names of the 70 elders who brought the law having been sent by Eleazar, for these were written in the letter. In other words, he's referring back to the letter of Aristeas, which says there were 72, and he says, I'm not going to give you their names, but he refers to them simply as 70. So there's a simplification. And I just want you to notice, because this is also on the next slide, that we have 70N here. 70 elders, 70 translators. This is what's going on in the earlier sections. Sometimes in the first few centuries of reference, you find just simply the elders, just the translators, without even the word 70. But that is dropped. Irenaeus will want to say the 70 elders. Jerome will talk about the Septuaginta translatores, or the interpretes. But by the time we come to Aquinas, we find that second bit has been dropped generally in him. Many references here. He is still using the Septuaginta as a plural. They were silent at this particular point. Now, of course, when you're surveying vast centuries, I haven't done the research to say everything that's going on here. There would be an awful lot of the story to tell. I actually think there's a complete research project that no one's ever done, which is the history of the terminology which leads to the Septuagint today. No, I don't think anyone's really dug into that, so I'd encourage you to do that. But even quite late, the N can be preserved. Here's a bit from the preface from the translators to the reader of the King James Version, where they say, "This is the translation of the 70 interpreters, commonly so called, which prepared the way for our Saviour among the Gentiles by written preaching, as St. John Baptist did among the Jews by vocal preaching." A beautiful sense of a translation having been preparing the way for Christ. Notice 70 interpreters, so they're using the name. Notice also the commonly so called, distancing themselves from the name, and so on. Then we find 70 plural goes to 70 singular. So obviously, originally the word 70 is a plural. But in French, it begins with les septante, the plural, les septante, and it then is reanalyzed as a feminine singular. This is easiest in German. You start with die Septuaginta, a nice plural, and then you reanalyze that as a feminine singular. This is going on in all sorts of languages. I've talked to various friends. My Hungarian friend told me it's happened in Hungarian as well. Modern Greek doesn't do that. It has kept the plural as plural. But most of these languages are doing that. And we find the same going on in English. And at the same time, the 70, the word Septuagint in the 17th century referred to people, not to a translation, a thing. And the earliest reference to it, referring to a thing, is said by the Oxford English Dictionary to be 1633. Looking at the examples in the OED, I think the 1633 example is actually ambiguous. It could be as early as 1646. Now let's remember that the OED is only the OED. If you do the sums on how long each the number of researchers they have and how much time they have for each word, they don't have much time for each word to do the research on the OED. So even though it's a really authoritative dictionary, I'm not saying that people couldn't find examples of earlier usage. I'm just saying this is where we're at the moment. But during the 17th century, the Septuagint word developed a plural, the Septuagints, which flourished for about 50 years and then went out of fashion, referring to the people who had made a translation in Egypt. When we look at John Owen's use in the 17th century, he will talk of the translation of the LXX with a dot, so it's clearly marking LXX as abbreviation. People weren't yet saying LXX like that, I don't think. Whether they said Septuagint or Septuaginta, I don't know at this stage, but it takes a plural verb. Half a century later, and we get to Matthew Henry, half of his occurrences are plural, half are singular. Now, I've got to confess here, I haven't done the text critical work on the Matthew Henry textual history in order to be completely sure what's going on in the earliest printings of Matthew Henry. Sorry about that. So but roughly, this is the sort of story which I think you're going to find when you start digging into people. Now, at the same time as we have these changes, so it's really from the 18th century onwards, we're going to have a singular Septuagint. We've got other things going on with the growth of what these 70 people supposedly did. So in the letter of Aristius, they translated the nomos, or the nomothesia, or nomima, in 72 days. Yes, 72 as well is the length of time it took. These seem to be references to the Torah, the Pentateuch. Philo's Life of Moses, again, they translated the nomos, and I would take this to be the same thing going on. Josephus, the nomos. Now, you can make an argument that there are broader uses of nomos. These occur in John and 1 Corinthians and so on. But I think that most people, when they look at these texts, would say that what these writers are saying is that the Pentateuch, if I can use an anachronistic 2nd century CE term, the Torah was what was translated by these 72 or 70 people. So it raises the question, what would Paul say? Would Paul be able to say, honey, sorry, where do you put my Septuagint? Sorry, that was very bad. Well, he couldn't, probably, unmarried. But what would he have called an edition of Isaiah, or if you prefer, Isaiah, which was in Greek? What would he have called it? Well, first I want to say he could not have called it the Septuagint as a as the name of a translation. Because for the earlier centuries, that was always the name of translators, not of a translation. But do we have any reason to think that he would have thought that parts outside the Pentateuch were translated by the 70, or were necessarily part of a unified translation movement with the 70? By the time of Justin Martyr in the 2nd century, we have explicitly named that he thinks that Ezra, Psalms, Isaiah and Jeremiah were part of the work of the 70. Flip on a little bit more, Clement of Alexandria talks of the law and the prophets. Origen has, of course, that debate with Julius Africanus, and he would argue that the work of the 70 includes Susanna, but he does not say that for Tobit and Judith. And so you go on through time and look at what exactly was included, and we see, of course, mission creep. Now I want to come on to the Complutensian polyglot. I know I'm skipping over many centuries here. I think it's very interesting to look at each age and just say, you know, with each book, and say, what evidence do we have for people saying that the 70 did this? So now I don't know how well this has come out. Oh, not that bad at all. So here we got the opening page of the Complutensian polyglot, and what you just have up here is we've got the Greek. Now, translatio, abbreviated, Graeca, and then we got our LXX there, with Latin interpretation. So this is what's here. So notice that it's clearly saying there in Genesis that it's giving you the Greek, and it's giving you that according to the 70 translators. But when you come, for instance, to the book of Joshua, likewise, you will see, again, it's got the 70 translators here. Let's go on to then the book of Ecclesiasticus, and what we find is something different. That what he gives us here is the Ecclesiasticus in Greek with Latin translation, no LXX there. We go on to, what have we got? Maccabees, again, no LXX. Now, question that came up yesterday with John Mead was, what about Baruch? And so here we have the pages where we go from Lamentations in the Complutensian polyglot over to Baruch. And Lamentations, yes, it's got the LXX in, and Baruch, no, it doesn't. So what they're doing is they're saying explicitly Baruch is not part of the work of the 70. Sorry?
And my sources were too late.
Oh, sorry. Too late, that's fine. Now, I want to show you this. It's not quite relevant for the talk. Well, it's a bit relevant, but this is the 2nd page of the Complutensian polyglot. So, first page is saying nice things about the Pope, and the 2nd page is addressing the readers, and we get just down to here, you see, this part of the paragraph. I'm going to blow that up for you, because what he talks about this, so we'll start from the at Wero here. Can you see it? Okay. But indeed, the books outside the canon, extra canonem, which the church rather for edification of the people than for authority of ecclesiastical doctrines for the sake of confirming them, has received, that only has the Greek text. Now notice this. Here we have, written in 1517, the year of the Reformation, but of course in prep for quite a time before, getting its imprimatur 3 years after the Reformation, dedicated to the Pope, someone saying that the books that don't have Hebrew are extra canonem, outside the canon. This isn't Trent, is it? But this is a cardinal. So just in terms of knowing that before the Reformation there was debate within the Catholic Church about the question of whether such texts were part of the most authoritative list, and that division between what you use for establishing doctrine and what you use simply for edification of the people, the sort of things you read in the 39 articles, it's already here in the Complutensian polyglot, and I want to thank Samuel Trugellis for pointing this reference out to me. Wonderful man who read widely. And then, of course, you have the ridiculous thing nowadays, so this is continuing the story of the gradual creeping of the amount of work done by the 70. That's the Magnificat, the Benedictus, the Nunc Dimittis, and the Gloria in Excelsis Deo, containing Lord, only begotten Son, Jesus Christ, and Holy Spirit. That is part of, apparently, the Septuagint, i.e. the Old Testament. Well, so that's the first part, just looking through how we get those 8 steps, which I would want to say any one of them looks like a small step, but cumulatively it just means you're in a very different place from where you started out. And although the word Septuagint has venerable antiquity, that is, we can trace a continuous apostolic succession, if you like, a succession going back all the way, that can give it a sense of great age. I want to say, but actually we're in a different place now, and you've got to reevaluate whether this is a term you should use at all. But if we do decide we're going to use it, what should we call the Septuagint? Well, of course you don't have to call anything the Septuagint, and it's actually quite recently that people have really come up very hot on this word. For instance, a couple of centuries ago, we have this edition. Holmes and Parsons produced their wonderful edition called the Vetus Testamentum Graecum, with variant readings. So when they made a Greek Old Testament 2 centuries ago, they didn't feel that they had to call it the Septuagint. Of course, when people look back, like Sidney Jellicoe looks back at the edition of Holmes and Parsons, he says in 1788, Holmes embarks on his edition of the Septuagint. But that's not what Holmes called it. A century later, what nowadays on Logos or Accordance will be called the Cambridge Septuagint is actually called the Old Testament in Greek according to the text of Codex Vaticanus, supplemented from other unsealed manuscripts with a critical apparatus containing the variants of the chief ancient authorities for the text of the Septuagint. In other words, a little bit more remote. Now, we know that Ralph's has Septuaginta, doesn't it? But then it says id est. What I really mean is the Vetus Testamentum Graecum. What I think we need to recognise is that there are just subtle changes from generation to generation. So actually, you're in a bit of a different place. And now we're in a generation where I think Septuagint seems so real because everyone's talking about it, but actually you can describe the same realities without that vocabulary. And if we do decide to use the word Septuagint, what are we going to apply it to? You see, if most of the Old Testament had been translated into Greek before Philo, and Philo thought that the elders had translated only the Pentateuch, who did he think had translated the other books? In Philo's mind, surely he knew of the other translations. And yet he presumably doesn't think that they were done by the 70. So they're part of something different. I think we can extrapolate that from the data we have on Philo. If Josephus thought that the work of the 70 that had translated the Pentateuch, who did he think translated First Esdras, which he used? And if we're going to have First Esdras and say it's part of the Septuagint, can you have Second Esdras as well when it's got so much repetition of material? And so you have this work of the 70 and they weren't very efficient. Why should we think that Paul thought that his text, for instance of Isaiah, was translated by the 70? If he, like Josephus, was a Pharisee, shouldn't we say, you know, similar date? Actually, Josephus is a little bit later, still doesn't think that the 70 went beyond the Pentateuch. Surely the most natural inference is that Paul did not think that parts outside the Pentateuch were translated by the 70. And then we start adding in the textual changes. An old quotation, so he wasn't up to date with the last 102 years of scholarship, but here is H.B. Sweet. There is a considerable weight of evidence in favour of the belief that the evangelist employed a recension of the LXX dot, I don't know how he pronounced that, maybe Septuagint, which came nearer to the text of Codex A, Alexandrinus, than to our oldest uncial B, Vaticanus. This point has been recently handled by Dr. Sterk, who shows that the witness of the New Testament almost invariably goes with Codices Sinaiticus A and F, and Lucian against the Vatican manuscript, and that its agreement with Codex A is especially close. It may, of course, be argued that the text of these authorities have been influenced by the New Testament, but the fact that a similar tendency is noticeable in Josephus and to a lesser extent in Philo goes far to discount this objection. Still more remarkable is the occasional tendency in New Testament quotation to support Theodotion against the LXX. Now, one of the things that we can look at and we can criticise a quotation like that is we know that you have to go corpus by corpus, book by book, in order to really deal with these things in our own age. But the point is this: at the grand scale of things, what let's say Göttingen is aiming for is they're aiming for the earliest version of the Greek that they can reconstruct in a stemma, whether it's 3rd century, whether it's 2nd century BC. That's their aim. Their aim is not to reconstruct the even harder thing to reconstruct, which is what was most common around in the 1st century AD. That's the really hard thing to do, because you can't do it by just going back in your stemmas. And that means that when you're asking from the perspective of a New Testament writer, the New Testament writers are not using consistently the earliest reconstructible form that we have of the text. Actually, there is a tendency for them to use it in what is, historically speaking, a somewhat revised form. Again, it's a tendency. We can talk more detail. Now, my friend Michael Law has told a story in his book, When God Spoke Greek, that there was a time when God spoke Greek, and then people changed the story to Hebrew. And it goes like this. The early church was using, this is a gross simplification of the story, but read the book, it's not very long. The early church used to use the Septuagint happily, and then along came Jerome, and he changed the direction fundamentally and spoiled that, and that's why we've got this Hebrew-based Old Testament now. Now, I want to tell a different story, and I want to begin the story a little bit earlier on. So there are, as far as I know, 26 languages, ancient Near Eastern languages, which have bilingual or trilingual inscriptions from before the 3rd century. So in terms of the amount, and this is again a great research project for someone other than me to do, which is the history of translation. The history of what it means to translate down the ages. There's lots of material on this. And I want to say that actually it seems to me, from a really superficial look over the material here, that there was no translation with systematic, thorough segmentation before the 3rd century. That is what you have, whether you have, let's say, the Rosetta Stone, which is obviously 2nd century, isn't it? But where you have Rosetta Stone and you have 3 texts, even the dates don't agree. When you have the Telfakeria inscription, you have the Assyrian and the Aramaic, they don't agree. When you have the Phoenician lining up against the Luvian in Kara Tepe, again, you find significant differences. Why? Because what's gone on is you've had a couple of scribes have had a conversation, and then they've gone off and they've each produced their text. We call them bilingual, but there's a huge number of these things where they do not actually align. This may not show up very well. It's just got a selection of them showing how, for instance, Aramaic, you can find bilinguals with Assyrian, Greek, Lycian, and Lydian, and so on. Now, what I think we've got to recognise is that, and I'm excluding here lexical lists, where they have, let's say, Sumerian and Akkadian word for words. That's lining up words. But generally, when you have texts in different languages, what they don't do is word-for-word translation. They don't even do phrase-for-phrase translation. They simply haven't segmented at that level the text in order to do that. When the Greek translation of the Pentateuch was first made, and I have no problem with thinking that 72 people made a translation of the whole Greek Pentateuch. That would have been by far the biggest ever translation exercise that had taken place in the history of the earth. Now, we've got so much translation theory, it's hard for us to imagine what it's like to begin doing that. We assume that everyone has like their 2 columns, and they start with what they're going from, and they go to what they're going to, and they go through phrase by phrase, sentence by sentence, whatever they do. We can't imagine even the work plan that you have when you think, I'm going to produce a Greek version of that in Hebrew, when you're dealing with that amount of task. And I think this has to be factored in. So I want to tell you a story without the same changes in direction of saying it was everyone was happy with the Septuagint, and then Jerome came along and persuaded everyone to use the Hebrew. And it goes like this. The Pentateuch was the biggest translation in world history by a long way. And this translation is both accepted and refined. It's accepted, but it could be adapted. If it were utterly rejected, you wouldn't even use it as a basis for further translation, but it is accepted. And what we see is a story of whether a revised Old Greek or Proto-Lucian or Kyge Theodosian, Symmachus, Aquila, Origen, Quintus, Sextus, Septima, and others unnamed, others lost, all partake in the same movement. I should have, which has to feel, sorry, I shouldn't say Jerome there, it should say Origen, in fact. No, Origen's already there. Well, Jerome, yes, I am saying Jerome there. Because he translates, but I would say you can see Jerome as on the same trajectory, which is saying, how can we follow the authoritative Hebrew more closely? Now, why would you have so many translations done if people were already happy with what they had before? So what I'd want to say is they have to feel that they're doing a better job than the person before. And there's lots of diversity in terms of the amount of segmentation that these translations have versus fluency. But usually, really crass generalization, there's an increase in formal alignment with the Hebrew. At the phrase level, they haven't all got down below that. So when we look at the various text versions that we have, and we ask the question, what did an ancient person call that? That's going to get different answers in different ages. Perhaps when you come on to the age of Augustine, he's going to claim that a whole load of these things were translated by the 70. But at the time of the New Testament, that won't be thought. If we are going to use the term, how do we decide what is the version of the 70? We might say, well, whichever is the earliest in textual terms, fine. But the problem is, whatever is earliest in textual terms may not be the same as the form of the text which was earliest thought to be by the 70. Let me put that another way. I don't know when the book of Judges was first thought to be by the 70. You may think that the A text comes first, you may think that the B text is typologically earlier. You can ask Will about that if you have any uncertainty. But the point is this, people's perception of what the 70 did, actually they may have first latched on to the 70 having done the thing that was not the earliest. So this is how we have a lot of confusion going on. Can you take refuge by saying, okay, I'm not going to use the word Septuagint, I'm going to talk about the word Old Greek, I'm going to substitute that word and somehow get around the problem? Well, of course, Old Greek is one of those other fuzzy terms, a lot of variation in style there, and even the oldest Greek that we have may still be in a revised form from the earliest translation. At least when we look at our earliest forms, it seems that the divine name, the use of the word Lord, Kyrios, there is not the earliest thing. I want to say, drop the term entirely, not just the word Septuagint, but dropping thinking of there being an it. There is a they, not an it. They is the pre-Christian Greek translations of the Old Testament, parts of the Old Testament, and remember that they don't have to be uniform. And why should we drop using this term? Well, I'd want to say that even the very best of scholars can be caught up in fallacious thinking by using this term. Someone, surely in the pantheon of textual scholars, Emmanuel Tov, has categorized Qumran manuscripts based on, there's a category of Qumran manuscripts that agree with G, namely Greek Old Testament. Well, okay, he doesn't use the word Septuagint there, he uses the word G, letter G. But the point is, using that as a category is potentially fallacious if there isn't a textual uniformity across all of your G. So, now that's at the top of the game. Surely another person in the pantheon of scholars is Martin Hegel, who would often say that the Bible, the Septuagint was the Bible of the early Christians. Other people say this numerous times. Well, this can be very confusing. When someone says that New Testament writers imitated the Septuagint, again, it's problematic. if we're going to talk about imitation, imitating Ecclesiastes in Greek, whether you think that's part of the work of the 70 or almost certainly not, is a different thing from imitating 1 Samuel or whatever it is, First Reigns. These are different things. So let's be careful when we're talking about imitating. Define what you think's imitated. Do some quantitative analysis of it. Don't just throw this out because there is no unified style. But of course the big cause of fallacies today is corpus-based searches on software, because the software defines what is in this artificial corpus of the LXX, and the students get this full sense of a reality of a corpus that they're searching. Now someone might say, well, why are you just picking on this term? Lots of terms are anachronistic. Why single out the Septuagint? Well, of course, I am not singling it out. I would get rid of a whole load of terms. The fact that other terms are objectionable is not a defense of using a bad term. So I've said I advocate using the word Scripture against a polyvalent word Bible, which can mean a physical object as well as a corpus of books. And I think it's an improvement. Actually, it's going back to earlier ways in order to do so. Sometimes there are transparently anachronistic terms, like Masoretic text. That's a bit safer because you know the Masoretes weren't around at the time. The moment you do any research on that, and so it's really clearly anachronistic, like the term Proto-Lucian. The word proto tells me not in real time. So actually that's less dangerous. But the Septuagint word combines anachronism and imprecision with a superficial impression of definiteness. So, what if you do want to keep using it? Well, my recommendation is either you use scare quotes or you just pinch yourself before using it. Or while using it. But for those who might want to come off, it could be a long path. And the point is, when you're addicted to a substance, when you're addicted to a word, and you allow yourself to use it, it feels like such a relief initially. Just that tension that's building up inside you just goes away. You use the word Septuagint. It's so easy to do, and the pain goes away. I would want to say you do have to go on a long rehab course. I still have relapses, and I just want to give my testimony as someone who has those relapses, that it is possible to break through and eventually get into a better way of life. Thank you very much.